Here we go. It's 5 after. I think we have a quorum and a bunch of people ready to have fun. So I will hand it over to the AAEEBL Task Force on Digital Ethics to lead us through an hour of great stuff.
So I'll go ahead and get us started. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about the work that the task force has been doing in the past academic year. We all thought that it was perhaps longer and shorter than an academic year, but it is in fact an academic year. Time seems to be moving at its own pace these days. I'll just start with a brief overview, and then I'm going to pass it off to Megan, who's going to talk a bit about the history and the process that we engaged with. So we'll start with the history and overview, and then Megan Haskins and Sarah will take us through a showcase of the first version of the principles document. Christina will lead us in an activity where we'll have an opportunity to apply principles to ePortfolio practice. We'll have a brief Q&A. And then I'll explain how those interested can get involved with the task force in year 2. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Megan Mize.
Hi everyone, I am Megan Mize. I'm at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, and I had the opportunity to take part in this task force this past year. And so we thought it would be worthwhile to pause and reflect, since we are a group that advocates for reflection on how we came to be and why we came to be a task force, and then also sort of share our process so that if you were engaging with something similar at your own institution, you might be able to replicate or draw on our experiences or learn from maybe not mistakes, but just things we might do slightly differently. And so let's start with the history here. And at the 2018 AAEEBL, there was a call for an ethics and ePortfolio task force because we could see that this was an evolving conversation, going to be a spot in the field that needed more directed attention. And then at the 2019 AAEEBL, there was actually a digital ethics forum in which we had a number of activities where we applied some scenarios and talked about strategies for things about privacy and so forth, which was then followed by a little post-it note session where people wrote concerns and placed them on large post-it notes outside the forum, which then allowed us to kind of code and develop breakout rooms centered on some of the major categories of ethical concern that evolved. And you can see here from the bullet points what those were at that time, things like digital citizenship, student development, faculty development, and new initiatives, and of course issues of policy and danger or security. And we thought if we could take the folks who are in the trenches, who are the practitioners, and go into rooms and really think about what are things we're seeing, how are we working to resolve them, we might be able to start crowdsourcing some strategies. And then from that emerged some suggestions when we started asking, what is it that we can do as a community to help new and established practitioners not have to reinvent the wheel at their own institutions? We have this kind of shared knowledge and experience. And what seemed to emerge from that was that the next step for AAEEBL would be to design a set of principles connected to digital ethics and e-portfolios, similar to some of our other organizations that we're attached to. So things like NCTE's National Council for Teachers of English, who have principles, so that anyone coming into the field might not have to start from scratch, right? And so if you would advance the slide. We had a pretty stellar, there you go, timeline in terms of process, and all credit to our team out at Auburn. Amy and Megan really kept us on track when it would have been really easy to get right off those tracks. And so I really want to give them just all the credit for keeping us together. But on the previous slide, you saw the call for participants that had been shared. That went out in September, so not too long after the conference. And I believe around 11 of us responded and stayed fairly active. And the pacing was basically a meeting per month. And in that first meeting in October, we really needed to wrap our minds around what is it that's been proposed. This is a pretty big project. It sounds really clean and sexy to say, let's just make some principles. But to have them have meaning and to have them be vetted and not just be kind of anecdotal, pithy little strategies, we really wanted it to have some gravitas and some weight. And so that very first meeting, we decided we're going to look at examples of how other groups are doing similar moves. We then kind of brainstormed what we think ethical concerns are with e-portfolios, and we found that that became expansive quickly. It was just a huge breadth of issues that might come up. And so we started talking about, let's ground this in the research. Let's see what's out there already. And so then we thought, let's eat this elephant in small bits and break up into small groups who then take some of those larger categories and start researching from there. And so then between November and December, we came back with this working document, many working documents put into one. And as you can see on this timeline, I think the phrase monster document is totally appropriate. It was huge. And just had a great deal of overlap. As you can imagine, the boundaries are really slippery as to where things are going to land in terms of categorization. And then we really started thinking, well, who are the audience? Who are the audiences for this? It's clearly plural. It's not just faculty, it's not just admin, it's also students, right? And then what are our goals for this, and how can that practically be done? We really wanted this to be a document that served a function, not that just lived out there as some sort of esoteric set of ideas, but that you could go in, read, and say, yes, that's me. How do I deal with this problem that they've just pointed at? And so we thought, okay, we'd like to have principles that are kind of aspirational. We'll give you hypotheticals so you can try to find yourself in that. And then we'll give you strategies that we think would help you address that issue. And so, I think we felt pretty good. We were high-fiving and backslapping as we rolled into January. And at that point, we were, of course, always editing, revising, reviewing. And we turned it over to the AAEEBL board to get their feedback and gave them a survey that we had put together, a form so that they could have some directed feedback. Like we would really like your attention directed here, 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 and then more generally, and looking at things like usability, purpose. Is this all aligned to what we said we think we want it to do? And they were very generous. They gave us just fantastic, actionable feedback. And so then in February, we maybe backslapped a little less. We said, okay, let's look at this again. And there were some major revisions, some trimming. It was a much merrier time. There wasn't a pandemic. And then we started talking about, how do we share this? We've generated a thing. We feel pretty good about this thing, and we need to make sure it has a platform that the largest amount of stakeholders and users can join in for this community. And so now we've moved into this phase that you see at the end of the timeline, where we're really doing technical edits, worked on an introduction. We thought it was really important to explain the purpose of these principles. People don't always understand kind of the why of having these float out there. And then we started looking at platforms. Since it is going to be a digital text, we wanted it to be interactive. And so we've played with a few iterations of that. And I think we've landed on one that looks pretty nice for now. And so I'm going to leave it there. But that was our process, and we went quickly.
Can I just hop in? This is my fault, but I blew past the members of the task force. Megan, if I could trouble you to go back. Now that Megan's kind of talked through the timeline, I do want to just take a moment and get recognition for these individuals. many of which are who are with us today. So as you can see, we had a range of members representing different institutional types, different regions, different nations, different positionalities in terms of them being administrators and faculty and parts of teaching and learning centers, or industry representatives. And so if we can just take a moment and appreciate them, and then we can jump into Sarah and Megan's work.
Yeah, I guess I'll take over for a few minutes here. My name is Sarah Zerhelen, and I'm at Appalachian State University. And one of the things that I was emailing Megan about this yesterday, that I've really enjoyed about being part of this group is that I have one of those weird jobs that crosses each of these areas. And so I'm responsible for administering the Writing Across the Curriculum program, but I also teach and I work with graduate students in the Writing Center. And so having a document that speaks to these different roles and kind of seeing it in creation has been really fun and to be a part of. And so I'm just wondering, I don't know how this works. Is it possible for me to share my screen really quickly to walk us through the document, and then it can just go back to Megan? Yeah.
Yeah, hold on.
Okay, so this is actually the document that will take you to the AAEEBL homepage. But what I wanted to kind of walk us through, and in fact, I'll show you if I pull it up here. Let me share my screen. And the image, well, yes, okay. Is it sharing?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So the image that was on the screen a moment ago is right here on the AAEEBL website. And you can click on these and get a little bit more information about each of them. Just the principle themselves will pop up. But if you want to see our full document, you can begin here, just like it says. And it will take you to Scalar, is how I'm going with the phrasing. I did a training last week and that's how they said it. So I'm sticking with that one for now. And we chose this platform. We had a lot of different conversations about it, but we chose it because it fit all of our needs and it had the level of interactivity. It's built, it's a creation from the Alliance for Networking Visual Culture, and it was built to house kind of academic projects like this, but it treats all text and media as objects, and it's building. And so you can do pretty interesting things with it, which we have just begun to explore. And so I just am going to walk you through kind of the setup of the document and some of the ways you can navigate it currently. And then Megan is going to talk about some specific uses of it. So on this first page, we have our principal summaries and table of contents. And this literally walks you through, you can scroll through and see each principle. You can click on any of those and it will take you to the larger page that has the abstract. And then as Megan was saying before, these are our strategies for applying the principle. Our scenarios are below that. And we've divided those up according to students and educators and then admin or staff. And so we have different scenarios for different positions. And then at the end of each principle are the relevant resources. And then when you get to the end of a page like this, there are ways to work through the document in other ways. So you might, for instance, say, okay, I've read about principle 3 and I want to continue on to principle 4, but you might narrow in and say, actually, the first scenario in principle 3 was really interesting to me. And so you could click on that and it will take you just to that page. So it's only scenarios, or the scenario 1 for principle 3. And this will show you the principle statement again with the scenario. And you'll also notice that this is tagged in student scenarios. So for instance, if I was a faculty member reading through this document thinking, maybe I just want to show some student scenarios to my students, I don't want them to read the whole document, you can click on that and it will actually take you to a page that just lists the student scenarios and it breaks those down according to principle, and then it starts with a short description of each one and you can go see the full one. So if you're navigating through these and you see one that speaks to your situation, you might click on it and go to find more information there. And we've done the same thing with the educator scenarios and with the admin and staff scenarios. There's also on the left-hand side in the hamburger menu, a drop down of all of the table of contents, and each of these arrows will take you again, to see what that area in the table of contents contains. We also have a glossary of key terms, which is featured at the end, but we've linked to those throughout the document. So for instance, Principle 1, support, access is one of the important terms there. And so you can see that that links out. And so access from the glossary is actually embedded in the page. And then if you wanted to go directly to the glossary, you simply click go there and it will take you to access, and you can always go back. So, or you could go to the full glossary if you wanted to see it. So there are a lot of ways to navigate through it. We're also really interested in the visual possibilities. This other menu item lets you visualize your material in different ways. And I think that the connections one is the most kind of interesting to play around with. So I'll show you that one. But it shows relationships between all the different parts that you've created, with a legend that you can kind of see, oh, we've made these different paths. But specifically if I were using this for a class and I wanted my students to perhaps find specific information, this would be a really useful place for them to go, because they could say, okay, well, I'm only looking at like how things are tagged, and so that's red, and that's how they would find like, okay, there's student scenarios, they're tagged right here, and that will take me directly to that. And I think this kind of visualization will help us in the future as we grow the document and think about the different ways that we're connecting information, because as Megan mentioned, one of the hardest parts about revising this text as we were working on it was finding the overlaps among the different areas that we had worked in. And so being able to visualize that in a different way, at least for someone like me, is really helpful. And so I'm hoping that really encourages development in that area in the future. And I think that those were kind of the big picture navigational issues. I know most people will be most comfortable just going to the table of contents and working through it, but I think from a usability perspective, especially for people who are in specific positions, to say, okay, this is the part that applies to me directly, will be particularly helpful. And during our Q&A, if anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it. It's been pretty fun to play around with, but I'll turn it back over to Megan now and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so I'm glad that Sarah went before me, because she and Amy definitely deserve the credit for the Scholar update, because I'm learning as you all are learning as Sarah's talking. So I did want to just kind of show an example of how this might work. So my context is that I work in an ePortfolio office. So I'm technically kind of in an administrative role, but I also work directly with students. And Sarah and I were mentioning earlier today, a lot of us say that our roles are unique, but I think those types of hybrid roles are actually increasingly common. And so what we realized was the scenarios would be useful for people to read in multiple contexts. And so while some of the scenarios are tagged, for example, as student scenarios, I think it's important to read them through the lens of your own context. So we intentionally decided to decrease the number of scenarios and increase their complexity. And what I mean by that is each scenario has sort of a few things that you can unpack. So they're really great opportunities to use if you're in a faculty development role. You can pull some of these scenarios and ask faculty to apply them to their own context. They're also, of course, useful with students to get them thinking about their own context. And it's definitely useful as well when you're communicating with stakeholders about the complexities of ePortfolios and what, for example, like a campus-wide implementation would require. So I've just pulled up principle number 5, which is access to technology. I think that's especially relevant with the COVID world that we're living in right now. And I just wanted to show sort of how it works. So I did want to touch a little bit more on the tags that we have here. So it really helped to have an international group, because we were able to identify terms that we were saying the same word and we actually meant completely different things. And so we tried to be really mindful of an international audience when we created these references. And so some of the words that you'll see defined in your context, you might think, why did they define that? And it's probably because it means a few different things depending on where you are. So I think that's one really valuable thing in the document. But I wanted to scroll down to the scenario. So this is an example of a scenario that a student needs to create an e-portfolio but doesn't have ready access to a computer. And in this scenario, the professor has thought ahead and created resources to support that student using a phone or a tablet or something like that for their device. And they've also created digital office hours instead of expecting the student to be face-to-face. So those are just a few examples in this scenario that should get faculty thinking, should also get students thinking about what they need, so they could see themselves possibly in a scenario like this and realize how they could advocate better for themselves. And it also helps those of us that are in an administration role think about what types of opportunities and support we need to be providing. So when I read this scenario as an administrator, I see that the professor is providing resources that are tech support for their students. That tells me that that's something that I could be creating and passing out to the faculty that are responsible for teaching e-portfolios. So that's an example of how a scenario that's like technically a student scenario sort of bridges all of the audiences that we had in mind. And then, of course, another thing that I think is especially useful for people who are maybe just now adopting e-portfolios or faculty who have heard about this and want to get started is these resources. Because they're separated out by principal. So if you are struggling with something very specific to the principal, we've identified some resources that'll be particularly useful for that. So I am going to go back to this. And I'm going to pass it over to Christina. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much for all the introductions before. And it's really fantastic to see the kind of final document and Scalar come together. And of course, still being worked on, but Sarah has been doing wonderfully linking everything. And that had always been kind of the vision, I think, of the task force as well, to make to apply our own principles, to make everything accessible, to link things and to bring things together, and also show how complex the subject matter is, yet also give an easy way into it. Now, initially we had thought to go with breakout rooms and have you all discuss either individual principles, kind of see from your perspective what has come up, where you might want to contribute in the future as well, where you might know, oh, here's another scenario that we could have as a reference. However, seeing that it's pretty much the AAEEBL board and a couple of others, and then the task force here, I think it would be better if we just had a conversation around what you think about the principles, where you can see them being applied on campus in your own situations, or also what you think, where you have any questions for us as task force. So kind of in a way, probably already pulling the Q&A a bit forward, yet also looking directly at the principles if you like, or if you'd like to explore the document a bit further, then we can also do that. And therefore, I think I did put the link to the Scalar document directly into the chat, so you can all access it from there. Alternatively, we can also go to this short URL here, just a second, where there are only the principles and not the abstracts, so just the taglines and the questions again, in order to show them a bit more. And so we kind of have a few minutes for that, probably around 10 minutes before going into the official Q&A, or if we pull them together, then we have almost half an hour still left. And Megan, if you can, please, I'll probably best go to the Scalar document, to the overview page, the principal summary and table of contents. The second page in there. that one. Mm-hmm. And yes, like me, everybody else was muted before. So if you'd like to say anything, we might even jump out of screen sharing so that we can see each other better in the gallery, because you can all open the document on your own screens. The links are in the chat.
I think starting with the first question on our activity here, like which principle is speaking to everyone, I think most pointedly right now, I'm trying to get the word out. I really keyed into that question of accessibility. I've had a lot of pushback recently from folks who have had to undergo that online shift, and so they're just feeling inundated. And of course, people are turning to e-portfolios as a form of online activity and assessment and so forth. But whenever I sit there and start talking about accessibility, people always talk as though it's extra. Oh, it's more work. That's the next step. And I really think we need to work as practitioners, even to people who are novice at it, to say, no, this should always be embedded in the e-portfolio design. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of interesting that it's one of our later principles, but right now I think it's probably one of the most pressing principles, because now students will feel the divide most pointedly. So that one stands out to me right now on our list.
This actually, so thinking about Morgan's session this morning, so you guys had started working on this last year. How has all the current situation that we're in really heightened or highlighted these various principles? Are there any that become especially important, as you just sort of mentioned, Megan, especially right now? So going back to that question, why e-portfolios and why now? And especially for someone like John, who's new to this and trying to explore to this, is there a greater imperative, or are there principles that really are so critical at this moment?
I think the accessibility and also equity and privacy security are very important. We've heard a lot about Zoom and having issues and then Zoom fixing things. And so those things come up more and more. And what we've also seen in our company is that spammers, scammers are just getting way more sophisticated, and therefore having tools on hand that from the university that help prevent those things. So I've seen a number of universities putting big messages in there. This email is coming from an email address that is not your own domain, just to make that more visible. It adds a lot of content to it, but hopefully it'll help people not click on every single link. And so the principles in this year were very much geared towards also kind of, I find, educating about digital literacy, and then establishing good practice. And as Amy had said in one of her tweets, everybody's for accessibility as long as it's not hard, kind of just paraphrasing it. Because yes, it does get hard, and especially looking at the WCAG 2.1s, they are really, really hard to create at times, because if every video is supposed to have a transcript or captions, how do we make also, for example, these conversations then accessible to people? What do we do? What practices do we need to change? And that is, I think, where the principles come in very nicely, because they make you think about that, but also look at it more from a positive side, so that we are not whinging and having negativity in there, but really also then eventually can give people some ideas of how things can be done, what they can support. Like Megan said, kind of get ideas how faculty could be supported, what administrators or learning support could be doing in order to establish these good practices, as well as give students and faculty assistance at hand.
Yeah, and to go off of that, I think one thing that we also tried to be mindful of that we were not mindful of at the beginning was framing the scenarios in a positive way. So all of the scenarios have a solution, because it was really easy for us to problem raise and sort of highlight these issues that people should be thinking about. But then as a group, we were challenged to come up with solutions for the scenarios that we had created. And so in the scenarios, there are typically some sort of resolutions that come from the challenges. But I remember, I guess it would have been our May meeting or maybe our April meeting that Megan Mize said, I think we need to reread this document with a COVID lens. And it was so true. Like all of a sudden, we kind of hypothetically knew about these things, but we were actually living it. And so we had the opportunity to revise some of our scenarios and things like that to go off of, like Megan said, the COVID world that we're living in. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I think what's really kind of telling is that we're gravitating towards these later principles. And when we first started talking about digital ethics way back last year, when we could all actually be in the same space, the first shot across the bow was people talking about like information literacy and things of like copyright and permissions. And that's really somewhat dropped out of the conversation right now, which is interesting. And going to also Megan's point about being positive, a lot of our peers will sometimes, or more tech anxious folk, will use these ethical concerns as kind of a way of deflecting e-portfolio advocacy. And so we kind of wanted to come back and say those aren't inherently the end all, like you can't do e-portfolios because there's issues of permissions. It's like, well, actually, you can, and here's how you can get around that. And in fact, it's a learning moment and it's learning digital literacy. And so that's why we really wanted to come at it in a way that tries to make the most of this potential stumbling blocks.
This is Terry. As you folks have been talking about the report, what it did for me is, since I was one of the people who this was shared with as you were developing, but to actually go back and spend a lot more time going through it in more detail in its current form, because I'm not familiar with all of the scenarios and so on and so forth. But as you were talking about the visualization, the ways in which to graphically and visually display part of what's, or the pieces that are part of this document, it keeps going through my head that, just as you were saying, Megan Mize, part of the usefulness of this is ultimately going to be, who are the allies that on our campuses, in our systems, even in state legislatures or whatever. Again, this is not your task now, but as I'm looking at this forward to others who are going to be allies, who are not directly engaged with your team, this is what could be the driver of action that people could actually understand. I mean, the notion of that Christina was talking about of the hacking that's going on. I mean, hacking, since we're all sitting in front of our computers now all day, every day, that's our lives, people are hacking and they're seeing the value of hacking, and it's taking so many forms. And so data are really in danger in multiple ways. And I don't think hardly anybody was interested in hacking or doing much with e-portfolios in the past. It was this little boutique stuff that was here and there kind of. But actually now that it's a perfect tool for so many things. And you're using it for your work and your report and so on. I mean, so it's doubly, triply important that these kinds of issues are taken seriously, because we can't guarantee the privacy and the confidentiality and the so on and so forth that we might have thought we could before, when nobody was paying much attention to us. And now people are more likely to do that. And the scenarios, I think the scenarios are a gem in terms of a way to try to share this with others, to have them take it on as their work. And if you've got a graphical visual kind of thing that you just gave us a tantalizing picture of, that it's a more powerful thing to communicate to those who are even farther removed from it, to actually accomplish many of these things, because the e-portfolio leaders on a campus are not the drivers of much of anything in reality. You put it into this larger, so many other things are going to be taking a place before it in people's minds and activities in this COVID era. But we can move it into that priority list through these kinds of strategies. And again, it's not your job forefront to do that, but I'm just so excited about the aspects of what you're doing just in the preparation of the report in your work that has these kinds of possibilities. Just bring in allies sooner rather than later, which I was sort of envisioning initially. Okay, we'll have this and then we'll take, man, there's things that we can be doing now in so many ways. And so maybe we need another task force or working group that's actually looking at how to take this out there and get it in front of other people using what you're already developing, because it's so powerful, I think.
And Terry, there I'm wondering if we could make the connection to the field guide for e-portfolios.
Sure.
So
Perfect.
for example, if we also put that into Scalar, then we have very similar format. We can
Yes.
work with the visualizations and then the cross-linking, and same thing with the with the references and the glossaries in there, and really build that network. That's what I really like, Sarah, about the visualization that you selected, that you see those connections, and that we kind of in a way built a web on that platform where all those resources flow together. Because I also completely agree with you, Terry, when you say things have changed since COVID and people are taking more note of portfolios, because they're becoming a more valid and more interesting alternative to your run-of-the-mill multiple choice exams or other types of assessments that are much, much harder to do these days online. For various reasons, and that would be a good opportunity to bring back all the knowledge and all the insight from the field guide and tie that in with the principles and kind of really make people see where the connections are.
It also gives us an impetus to revisit the field guide.
Yeah, and keep both. I mean, we've been discussing same things that we've been discussing in the field guide for how do we keep it alive? How do we keep it current? What would all of that entail? And yeah, exactly, those conversations then come in.
Well, and I think to speak back to what you were saying, Christina, about the visualizations, one of the things that struck me, because I've literally, I mean, this has been the week of working on that document because of the way we got onto Scalar. I mean, it was just one of those, it took a long time to get access, and then we did, and then the trainings got moved back. And so it was like, all right, I'm just going to dive in and see how it works. And as I was adding material and I kept looking back at the visualizations, it helps you see what is there, but also what is not there. And so one of the things I noticed yesterday was, which I had never noticed before all that time working on the document, is that we have more than twice as many student scenarios as we have admin staff scenarios. And I saw that looking at the visualization and thought, oh, okay, well, that's a place where we need to think, you know, have some balance and work on that. And so thinking about just what you can see through that visualization, right, in terms of continuing to grow the document, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, cool.
And I think to Sarah's point and Terry's point, like we've always conceptualized this as a living project because digital ethics is so capacious, but also so fluid in that as long as technology continues to progress, this topic will continue to progress. And so I'm really excited to think about how this isn't an ending point for the work that we're doing, but more of a checkpoint. Maybe a little bit of the passing of the baton in some ways, but we're really just getting started. When we were developing this draft, we had 3 whole sections of our brainstorm monster document that Megan Mize alluded to that we didn't touch. And so we're really, I think, at a place now where we can start thinking about where those extra bits begin to fit into this conversation.
Well, and kind of pulling together some of the threads that have been discussed here, in terms of getting it out there, Terry and others, we do have small subgroups of the task force that have signed up to publicize the work via different publications, whether it be the IJUP or EDUCAUSE Review, different places where we intend to publish something about this. And we've been intentional about publishing those things in different ways with different focal points, so that we're not just taking the same article and submitting it in 10 different places, but also to highlight different aspects of not only the product, but the process. As Megan brought up at the very beginning when she was describing the history, it's instructive to do that so that others can repeat the process with other topics or even similar topics. And I know before we close today, that there'll be a call for participation in some of the fun. But I think the other threads that kind of tie some of this together, Terry, you mentioned the concept of engaging different stakeholders both on and off campus, and that is ideally the theme of next week's AAEEBL annual meeting. Part 3, week 3 is engaging campus stakeholders, and we can expand that conversation. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that you are one of the people that is going to be a kickoff conversation. So well done, lad, of putting that little nugget out there for me to grab onto and serve to everyone else. I'm gonna let go of the microphone because I know there's more to say, but I just have to, I think it's been said in the chat and other places, but the amount of work this group has done is amazing. And the quality of work, so not just the quantity, but the quality of work is amazing too. And to Amy's point, it only reflects a small portion of what we envisioned at the beginning. So that's the scope of the world we're in right now. And I'm just proud of the group.
And I think because the chat isn't coming through in the recordings of Zoom, I think, just to bring in, Megan had mentioned that, yeah, we haven't even looked at ethics in e-portfolio assessment. And what we have to realize, the principles that are there for this year's Digital Ethics Task Force were only about a third. And I think Amy mentioned that earlier. But just to really highlight it, there's way more to come. And maybe actually some of the topics that we had brainstormed back in September last year may not be that relevant, and others are coming up more, so that the focus might also shift to compared to what we thought of how the task force is going to continue. So that'll definitely be good to see in which direction the next year's task force is going to take it, and what the big questions are, and whether it is in a similar fashion like we've worked, or in a slightly different one, now that everybody got way more comfortable talking in these online sessions and working online and sitting in front of online communication channels all day long, and see how that also evolves and how our practices evolve.
I do want to just jump in and open the floor for questions. So we are obviously happy to talk about this process and the product that we have. But we also are happy to answer questions specifically about the document or about our own practices, or really anything that you all have. So I did just want to leave a few minutes if there are specific questions or even just thoughts about the process.
Well, I wanted to ask, I mean, because I wear primarily a faculty development hat on in my day job, and not to pick on John, but I know he's newish to the community and thinking about these issues. And I wondered whether you spoke at all about, in your brainstorming, ways to partner with the principles and scenarios, actual practices, you know, because I'm thinking, and I again, I don't know if this is true, John, but I know that, you know, as a faculty member and someone who trains faculty members, that, you know, that this could be a potentially overwhelming kind of a thing. And I love the idea of, you know, a session that's specific to COVID and this current context. I love the idea of maybe highlighting accessibility or other principles that we know are kind of rising to the surface in this moment. But I always am like, give me the, like, how can I take this activity and adapt it for my own context to kind of keep these ideas in mind? So I don't know, have you all thought about that at all?
Yeah, and that was actually, sadly, one of our sessions for the conference was essentially that, like thinking about how when you read this document, what are some examples of this in practice? And then I think in an ideal world, we would like to make those outward facing so that faculty can reflect on how they are putting the document into use, and then the other faculty can see how that works. Our office does some interesting work where we publish in the disciplines that we collaborate with, and I think that's really useful because that then means that the people who are practicing in those disciplines are reading those publications. And so I think it would be really interesting to get this out and then see what comes up in biology, see what comes up in forestry, and what comes up across the disciplines, and where we can get that out to the people that are actually going to be, you know, instructing those students.
I love that idea, and I wonder, I mean, just because our last session was with Merlot, and of course that's a big open educational resource, and you know, I somewhere on a slide somewhere, you know, the crowdsourcing appeared as a, you know, and I wonder if it might be a kind of a fun thing to crowdsource. Here are the principles, you know, share your activities and practices that go along with those principles. We could put that out to the 300 plus people that are attending this workshop as a start. And then again, we've got connections to the Merlot community and beyond AAC&U. And I mean, I think we could probably garner quite a lot of interest around that.
And so those additional resources or checklists, or here's how you can get started and so on, we did talk about that in the beginning, but then the focus was really to nail down the scenarios and get the principles. And so some of that can be found in the resources. But for me, it also really helps to see the document, and not really just as the document in Google Docs, but the document as Sarah has created it now, because it helps just to envisage and say, okay, where can we put pointers in? Where can we now link to something else that is that building block that can then sit in a sidebar or be tagged and then be incorporated to really have that holistic ecosystem, because it's not a document anymore as such. It is much, much more, because it points just to so many things. And that would be really wonderful to have contributions from other people who have already created tons of resources that they are hopefully able to share and make accessible to everybody, that they then become part of the online platform.
Well, and I think, yeah, I mean, 100%, that was one of the hopes of using Scalar, right? Is that we can continue to add links to all kinds of different materials, videos, images, text, you know, all of these different kinds of resources that people have. You can't see this in the current version because it doesn't exist yet, but there's a great annotation tool. So if you put in a video, you can annotate the whole video for people to sort of understand, and you can tag. And so one of the things I think that I would love to see are resources that are then linked to multiple principles to show the interrelatedness of how you might be using this practice because you're thinking about accessibility, but actually that's also related to privacy concerns and copyright, you know, that all of these concepts are really, really interrelated once we start putting them in practice.
Yeah. I would love to see that work included in this hypertext, but maybe also presented in a way that's going to equitably recognize the labor that comes with developing those materials. Like I could see a special issue of AAEEBL's journal, for example, where maybe it's just how do you apply these principles, and we get a wealth of those resources collected in one place, and then they also move to the hypertext. And then that way, the people who have developed them get a publication, they get the, you know, the thing that will be recognized within their own institutional community, but they also contribute to this effort. I think, right, thinking about the author and how this is valuable for the author, that's a part of digital ethics. And so Megan and I have had so many conversations across our office where it's like, we need to live these values. And right, like taking a step back and being, how can we do this in the most ethical way?
And I wonder if that then eventually also comes to a conversation saying, well, what is actually considered a publication? Because does it really always just have to be the journal article, or the book. Why can't a hypertext like this also be recognized? Because it has oftentimes much more richness in it. It is a living document, and kind of usually the journals are done and dusted and you put them into the bookshelf. But a project like this that continues to live, that is being updated, there's so much effort in there by individuals or by groups of people. And so I think it would also be good for academia to recognize those things more. I mean, the internet is not new anymore. We've had it for a few decades now, but practices like this haven't really moved on, like we also see in a lot of other areas where we kind of go back to the old ways, and it's still the new thing, even though it's been there for 20, 30, or 40 years.
I think the reward and recognition piece is so, I'm going to want to just say it because, you know, the AAEEBL board, we've really spoken quite a lot about how impressed and grateful and thankful and, you know, amazed at your efforts that, you know, and so we've been thinking about, you know, also ways that AAEEBL can reward and recognize you as the task force members, you know, beyond, you know, an AAPR publication or, you know, making sure that we've got this on our website. And so, so if there are specific things that would be helpful for you as individuals, then please let us know. We are cooking up some other stuff as well, but yeah, but we definitely just want to make sure that this effort for you is also rewarded for you professionally and personally. So anyway, I just wanted to say out loud because we just so appreciate what you've been working on.
Well, in the 3 to 4 minutes that we have left before the end of the hour, want to make sure there's time to make any formal, maybe it's an announcement of an announcement that we are going to have a call for year 2 participation and other ways for people to get involved. Look at that. And there's a slide.
Yes, so if any of you would like to be involved in year 2 of the task force, we would love to have you on board. We've tried to make this as simple as possible. So all you do is go to the bit.ly link, which maybe Kevin and Helen and Tracy can send the bit.ly link out to the community afterwards. And you fill out a short application. It's just your CV, a brief statement explaining why you want to be involved, and then if you have it, your e-portfolio. We really encourage anyone interested to apply. Our community, I think, has done so well because we are so diverse, because we hold different positions in different institutions and different organizations across the world. And so we want the variety of perspectives there. And so if you're thinking, well, I don't have enough experience in this area, or, well, I only work at this institution and it's small, we don't care. Please apply. Like, we'd love to have you. So we are going to ask that you put in that application by September 1st, because we would like to have our first meeting in October, as is our emerging tradition, so we can start thinking through the messy process that is, where do we go from here?
It's been definitely a wonderful experience being on the task force. It seems like AAEEBL group work tends to work really, really well. And in particular, Amy and Megan Heskin kept us on track. Organizing meetings, always having links there, getting the minutes out and notes, and checking in with people where things are at. And so that's been extremely helpful to stay on the ball, especially in the times where everybody was kind of disrupted in every aspect of life. And so that's how we were able to just make sure that we actually are at the point where we are today. So I'd very much like to say thank you, especially to the 2 of you, and then also to the rest of the task force members, because the conversations were really good to have those online once a month and make progress on the topics.
Yes, I totally, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I totally agree. And I'll add, anyone who's currently on the task force and wants to stick around for another year, there's an option for that too. You just put your name, your email in, and you say, I'm a current member. I want to stay.
We won't require you to upload your ePortfolio again. So, we are out of time. I did want to just say that we have an email address. Amy, I might need you to pop on and say what our email is. If you have any questions about the document or about the potential to apply to be in the task force, you're welcome to email that. I'll wait for Amy.
Oh no, I gave you the wrong one. It's AAEEBL Digital Task Force at Gmail.
There we go. Yeah.
I'm gonna pop it in the chat.
Yeah, we'll type it in the chat, but Amy and I manage that email address, so we'll definitely get back to you. So if you have any questions about the document or the process or really any of the above, we're happy to answer questions via email. And I think that's it. Kevin, are there any housekeeping things we need to do before we wrap up?
Well, everybody should go to the collaboratory right now while you're inspired to put any resources, tools, or other ideas that examples that you want to share related to digital ethics that may either be referenced in the principles or not, so that we can make sure that we're calling attention to different aspects of the work in different places for people who are participating in this month-long experience but may not have been to this event. And then we are going to keep the party rolling, so everybody rest up over the weekend, and we hope to see you all next week, asynchronously, synchronously, virtually, and otherwise. And so again, thank you all for a really awesome session. And we're looking forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thanks, everybody. This was fun.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.